The moment George Alderton saw the photograph, he forgot how to breathe. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of gray, bone-cold Tuesday that settles over Halifax like a wet wool blanket and refuses to lift. George had been sitting alone in the corner booth of a diner he'd never been to before, a small, bright place called Sonny's on Agricola Street, the sort of diner with laminated menus and a pie case that rotates slowly in the window. He'd stopped in because his driver had taken a wrong turn, and the rain had started without warning, and George Alderton, for all his wealth and his 3 properties and his name on a hospital wing, had found himself standing on a wet sidewalk without an umbrella like any ordinary man. He hadn't meant to stay long. He'd ordered coffee black and sat watching the rain streak the window. He wasn't thinking about anything important. That was the strange part he'd remember later, that his mind had been perfectly empty. No board meetings, no legal filings, no grief that had become so familiar it had started to feel like furniture. Just the rain and the coffee and the gray November light. And then the boy sat down across from him. Not asked, not waited for an invitation. Just sat down, pulled off a soaked toque, set it on the table between them, and looked at George with a directness that most adults never managed. He was perhaps 11 years old. His jacket was a size too small and missing 2 buttons. His sneakers were wet through, the kind of wet that meant he'd been walking for a while. He had dark, serious eyes and a bruise of exhaustion under each one, and his hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain. "That watch," the boy said. He pointed at George's left wrist. "My dad has a watch exactly like that." George looked at the watch. It was his wife's father's watch, a 1962 Longines with a worn leather strap, the face slightly scratched from 40 years of use. George had worn it every day for 6 years, since the week of the funeral. It was not the kind of watch you saw twice. "I'm sorry," George said. The watch with the little anchor engraved on the back. The boy said it simply, like a fact he'd been carrying and needed to set down. "My dad has the same one. He keeps it in a wooden box under his cot. He says it was his grandfather's." George did not speak for a long moment. The watch on his wrist had belonged to his wife's grandfather. It had come to him through her, through the reading of the will, 6 years ago, and before that it had been in her family for 3 generations. The anchor engraved on the back was a private detail, a detail that wasn't visible unless you flipped the watch over and looked. The diner was warm and smelled of bacon grease and coffee and something sweet from the pie case. The boy was watching him carefully. "What's your name?" George asked. "Teddy," the boy said. "Teddy Baird." George had a great deal of money. He had learned, over the years, that money was almost entirely useless in the face of what actually mattered. But it had also taught him patience because you couldn't build anything real. A company, a relationship, a life, by rushing. So he did not rush now. He set his coffee cup down. "Would you like something to eat, Teddy?" The boy looked at him for a moment as if calculating whether this was a trap. Then he looked at the pie case. "Maybe," George flagged down the waitress. Teddy ordered hot chocolate and a grilled cheese sandwich without looking at the menu, which meant he'd been in this diner before, which meant he was local, which meant he hadn't come far. The waitress left, and the boy put both hands flat on the table and looked at George again with those dark, careful eyes. "You flipped the watch over," the boy said. "After I mentioned the anchor, you checked." He had. He hadn't even realized he'd done it. "Old habit," George said. "It's the same watch," Teddy said. He said it without drama, without any awareness of what he might be pulling loose in the world. "The anchor's in the same spot, bottom left corner of the back. My dad showed me once. He said the man who made it put it there so the owner would always know which way was home." George was 58 years old. He had buried his wife, Joanna, 6 years ago, or believed he had. He had stood at a graveside in Prospect Cemetery in the rain, and he had felt the world change shape around him, and he had spent every day since trying to remember the shape it used to be. He had worn her grandfather's watch every day as a kind of anchor himself, a way of keeping some thread attached to her. He had never told anyone about the engraving. Not his accountant, not his assistant, not the colleagues who'd attended the memorial. It was a private thing, a small, quiet piece of her he kept for himself. Teddy's hot chocolate arrived. The boy wrapped both hands around the mug and said, almost to himself, "He never really talks about where he came from, just that he had a family once, that there was someone he lost." George looked at this boy, This thin, rain-damp 11-year-old sitting across from him in a diner he'd never been to before, and he thought, this is not a coincidence. He was not a man who believed in coincidences. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in evidence, in the long, complicated chains of event, and consequence that connected one thing to another. And the chain that led from his wife's grandfather's workshop in Lunenburg in 1962 to this diner booth on Agricola Street in Halifax on a November Tuesday was not something he could explain by chance. "Where is your father now, Teddy?" he asked. The boy's expression shifted. Something careful moved behind his eyes. "Why? I'd like to speak with him. About the watch?" "About the watch. Yes." Teddy took a long sip of hot chocolate, set the mug down. "He's at the shelter on Gottingen Street. We've been there about 2 weeks. Before that, we were in Truro." He said it the way children sometimes said difficult things, flatly, without self-pity, because self-pity took energy they didn't have. George sat very still. "What's your father's name?" "Patrick," the boy said. Patrick Baird. The name meant nothing to George, but Joanna's maiden name had been Baird. He told himself not to leap. He was a methodical man. He had made a career of not leaping. On the drive across town in the rain, his driver had come finally, apologetic, and George had given him the address on Gottingen. He sat in the back seat and told himself there were many explanations. Joanna's family was not small. She had cousins. The name Baird was not uncommon in Nova Scotia. The watch could be a replica or a different watch with a similar detail. The boy could be mistaken. He told himself all of this. He told himself none of it. The shelter was a low brick building with a hand-painted sign and a door propped open with a cinder block. A volunteer with a clipboard looked up when George came in, clocking his coat, his shoes, the haircut that said money without shouting it. George had learned to move through spaces like this without making people feel observed, a skill that had taken him years. "I'm looking for Patrick Baird," he said quietly. The volunteer directed him down a hallway past a row of folding tables where men and a few women sat eating dinner from styrofoam trays. George walked slowly. He was not sure what he was looking for. He'd seen only one photograph of Joanna's brother, her estranged brother, at their wedding 17 years ago. A younger man then, leaner, the kind of lean that came from outdoor work. She had not spoken of him often, and when she did, there was a complicated pain behind her voice that George had learned to leave alone. He found him at the end of the hallway, sitting on a cot in a room with 6 other cots, reading a paperback. The man was perhaps 50. He was lean still, but a different kind of lean now, the kind that came from not enough. He had Joanna's eyes, dark and direct and a little too observant for comfort. He looked up when George came in. He looked at George the way you look at someone you don't recognize but feel like you should, and then something shifted in his face, and George understood that he was looking at a man who had spent a very long time not being found. "You're him," the man said. Not a question. "You're George." George stopped. "You know who I am. Joanna talked about you." The man's voice was hoarse, like someone who didn't use it much before. George crossed the room and stood at the end of the cot. He did not sit down. "Before what?" The man, Patrick, Joanna's brother Patrick, set the paperback face down on the cot and looked at George for a long time. "Before she left," he said finally. "Before she went back to Halifax, before she married you." He said it simply, not bitterly, just as a sequence of events that had happened in the world. "She died 6 years ago," George said. His voice was very level. Patrick Baird said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know, you know, I found out after. I didn't know until 2 years later. Someone sent me a newspaper clipping." He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck. I'm sorry I wasn't there. We hadn't spoken in a long time. Things that were my fault. I should have reached out. After she married you, I should have found a way back. I didn't." He looked at his hands. "That's on me." George sat down then, on the edge of a neighboring cot, because he suddenly needed to. He thought of Teddy, the boy's face in the diner, those dark eyes that were Joanna's eyes 1 generation removed. He thought of the watch. "The watch," George said. "Where did you get it?" Patrick reached under the cot and brought out a wooden box, small, cedar, the kind sold at gift shops in tourist towns along the South Shore. He opened it and held it out. The watch inside was identical to the one on George's wrist. Same face, same worn strap, same small anchor engraved on the bottom left corner of the back. "Grandpa Baird left 2, Patrick said. 1 to Joanna, 1 to me." He looked at the watch on George's wrist. "I didn't know she'd given hers to you." George pressed his thumb to the glass face of the watch he wore. She'd given it to him the morning of their 5th anniversary. She hadn't explained why then, just put it in his hand and said, "Keep this for me." He'd understood later, at the reading of the will, that it had been her grandfather's, that it had been important. He hadn't understood until this moment that there had been a second one. "Teddy," he said. "The boy. My son." Something moved across Patrick's face, not pride exactly, but the complicated, private weight of a parent. His mother passed when he was 3. It's been the two of us since then. George looked at the man on the cot. This man who was the last living piece of Joanna's blood family. This man who had been invisible for 20 years, who had Teddy's eyes, or rather, Teddy had his, who had spent 2 weeks in a shelter in Halifax, without knowing that his sister's husband lived 12 minutes away in a house that had 7 bedrooms and 4 people rattling around in it. "How long have you been in Halifax?" George asked. 3 weeks. Why Halifax? Patrick was quiet. He looked at the watch in the box. "I don't know, exactly. We were in Truro. We'd been in Truro for a while. Last month I had this feeling. I wanted to be near the coast, near the place we grew up. Joanna and we used to come to Halifax when we were kids. Our aunt lived here." He shrugged. It was the shrug of a man who had learned not to trust his own instincts. "I thought maybe there'd be work." George thought of Teddy sitting down across from a stranger in a diner and pointing at a watch. He thought about the particular, fearless directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be self-conscious. He thought of all the Tuesdays he'd spent in this city alone, all the mornings he'd eaten breakfast across from an empty chair, all the rooms in that house that no one went into anymore. He made a decision. It was the kind of decision that looked impulsive from the outside but felt, to George, like something he'd been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. "Come and have dinner," he said. "Both of you." Patrick looked at him with the kind of wariness that came from having needed people and been let down. "We don't need charity. That's not what I'm offering." George held Patrick's gaze. "You are the last family I have left from Joanna. You have a son who sat down across from a stranger in a diner and asked about a watch." He paused. "That's not nothing. That's not charity." Patrick Baird looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the watch in the cedar box. "He does that," Patrick said quietly. "He just sits down. I've told him 100 times. He doesn't listen." There was something in his voice that was not quite a complaint. "Smart boy," George said. "Frightening boy." But there it was, the edge of something. The faintest edge of a father's complicated, helpless love. It took Patrick 4 days to agree. George did not push. He returned twice more to Gottingen Street, once with Teddy there, once without, and each time he sat and listened more than he talked. He learned that Patrick had worked in boat repair and renovation for 20 years and was extraordinarily good at it. He learned that Teddy was in grade 6, had read 41 books in the past year, and had an opinion about every single one of them. He learned that Patrick had made enough mistakes in his 40s to fill a longer conversation, and that he was not a man who excused himself. On the 4th day, Patrick brought Teddy to George's house on Young Avenue and stood in the front hallway looking at the height of the ceilings and said, flatly, "This is too much house for one person." "I'm aware," George said. Teddy was already 3 steps inside, looking at everything with an expression of scientific interest. He found the staircase. He found the room with the built-in bookshelves along every wall. He stood in the doorway of that room for a long time without going in, which George would not understand until later, when Teddy explained that he'd been trying not to want it too much. That night they ate dinner at the kitchen table. George had cooked, badly, a pot of seafood chowder that was lumpier than intended, and the conversation moved slowly at first and then, gradually, less slowly. Patrick talked about their grandmother's house in Lunenburg, which George had heard about from Joanna but never seen. Teddy told George that the chowder was too salty, but that he'd eaten worse, which George found unexpectedly funny, and laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. Later, after Teddy had fallen asleep on the couch under a blanket, he'd fought it, the way children fight sleep, and lost suddenly and completely, mid-sentence. Patrick sat across from George at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of tea and said, without preamble, "She used to talk about you like you were the most solid thing she knew, like nothing could knock you over." George looked at his mug. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a lot of things. She was also right about a lot of things, usually both at the same time. Patrick curled both hands around his tea. She would have loved Teddy. She was good with kids. Better than I was, and he's my own. She was good with everything she gave her attention to, George said. They sat in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable. The kitchen smelled of chowder and wood polish, and the particular warmth of a house that had been cold for too long and was finally heating up. "I'm not looking for anything," Patrick said at last. "I want to say that clearly. We're not. I'm not here for money or for the connection. I made my own choices and I own them." "I know," George said. "I just wanted you to know that, so there's no confusion." Patrick nodded. He looked toward the other room where Teddy was sleeping. "He talked about you for 3 days after the diner. Said he had a feeling about you." A pause. "He gets feelings. I've given up trying to explain them." "What kind of feelings?" "The kind that turn out to be right." Patrick said it with the careful tone of a man who was not superstitious and wasn't entirely sure anymore. George thought of a Tuesday in November, a wrong turn, a sudden rain, a diner he'd never been to. He thought of sitting in an empty booth and having his mind go perfectly quiet, and then the sound of a toque being placed on a table. He thought of Joanna, who had always said that the universe was more interested in people than people gave it credit for. The weeks that followed were not seamless. Nothing real ever was. Patrick had his pride, which was extensive, and George had his habits, which were deeply ingrained, and they circled each other carefully. At first, the way two men do when they're both trying not to need anything. There were awkward mornings and silences that went on too long. Patrick declined offers, and then accepted them later in different forms. George learned to phrase things as practical rather than generous. Patrick found work at a boatyard in Dartmouth through a contact George quietly identified and then did not mention, which worked well as a fiction for both of them. Teddy moved through all of it with the same straightforward confidence that had made him sit down at George's booth in the first place. He enrolled in school in January. He discovered the bookshelves. He asked George one evening in February if he could show him a photograph, and then held up his phone to show a picture of his class project, a hand-drawn map of the Halifax explosion, meticulously labeled, which he'd been working on for 2 weeks. "That's excellent work," George told him. "I know," Teddy said, without a trace of arrogance. He said it the way a person says it when they've put in the hours, and they know what the hours cost. "My teacher wants to enter it in the district thing. You should let her." "I'm thinking about it." He pocketed his phone. He had a way of walking out of rooms that reminded George often of someone else, that particular quality of assurance, of moving through a space as if it had always been his. In March, George found Patrick in Joanna's old study, the room he hadn't opened in 2 years, standing in front of the bookshelf, not touching anything, just looking. George stood in the doorway. Patrick turned. "Sorry," Patrick said. "The door was open. I wasn't." "It's all right," George said. He came into the room. He hadn't been in it himself in months. It smelled faintly of her, not her perfume, which was long gone, but some deeper, less definable quality. The particular atmosphere of a room where someone had spent a great deal of time thinking. Patrick was looking at the photographs on the shelf. There was one from their wedding. Joanna in the garden of her parents' old house in Chester, laughing at something off camera, her hair coming loose. "She hated being photographed," Patrick said. "She always laughed to get out of standing still," George said. "When we were kids, she'd make a face. Every time. Every single family photo. She did that in the wedding photos too." The photographer was not pleased. They stood together in the room that had been hers. Outside, the March light was thin and pale, but it was getting longer now, the days, adding minutes back one at a time the way they always did, that slow transaction between winter and something else. "Thank you," Patrick said, not looking at George, looking at the photograph. George did not ask what for. He understood what for. It was Teddy who found the letter. This was in April, a warm afternoon, Teddy doing what he'd started doing on weekends, sprawling across the reading chair in the room with the bookshelves which had become, without anyone officially designating it, his room for reading. George had given him the run of the shelves months ago, and Teddy had been working through them in a way that was not random at all. George noticed, but followed some internal logic that Teddy had so far declined to explain. The letter was tucked inside a copy of The Stone Angel, Joanna's copy, her name written in pencil on the inside front cover, a book she'd read in school and kept for reasons George had never asked about. It was a single folded page, handwritten, and addressed in Joanna's handwriting to no one in particular, more of a note to herself. Teddy came to find George in the kitchen. He held out the page carefully, the way he'd learned to handle things that belonged to another time. "I think this is important," he said. George read it standing at the kitchen counter. It was not a long letter. It was the kind of thing a person wrote when they needed to say something to themselves, private, not intended to be found. In it, Joanna had written about her brother, about the years they hadn't spoken, about the specific, useless guilt of failing to repair something when you still could, and about the hope that was still there nonetheless. She wrote, "I still believe we find each other again. I believe the things that belong together eventually arrive at the same place. I don't know when, but I know it's true." George folded the page again carefully. Teddy was watching him. "Did you read it?" George asked. "The first sentence," Teddy said. "Then I stopped. It felt like not mine." George looked at this boy, this 11-year-old with the dark, serious eyes and the fearless habit of sitting down in strangers' booths, and thought of a rainy Tuesday in November and an empty coffee cup and the way the world had been perfectly quiet just before it changed. "She would have liked you very much," George said. Teddy thought about this for a moment with the particular seriousness he brought to most things. "I think I would have liked her too," he said. Then he went back to his book. That evening, George called Patrick into the study and gave him the letter. Patrick read it sitting in the armchair that had been Joanna's, the one by the window that caught the late light. George stood near the door and did not watch, but he stayed. Patrick needed to not be alone for it, even if he didn't know that, even if no one said so. When Patrick was done, he sat for a while without speaking. His hands rested on his knees. The light came through the window the long way, the way it did in April when the sun was finally remembering its job. Eventually, Patrick said very quietly, "She always knew, didn't she?" George considered this. "She usually did," he said. Patrick folded the letter with the same care that Teddy had used and set it on the table beside the chair. He did not give it back. George did not ask for it. It belonged to him now in the way that some things belong to people, not through ownership but through need. By May, the house had rearranged itself. Not officially, not in any legal or even stated way. Patrick was working steadily, saving, talking about a place of his own in the fall. Teddy had won the district competition with his map and had immediately started on a new project. A model of the HMCS Sackville, built from scratch, which he was constructing on the dining room table that George never used. It was a fuller house than it had been. Fuller and louder and more complicated. There were dishes in the sink that weren't George's, and someone was always losing track of the good scissors. And Teddy had opinions about the breakfast cereal situation that he expressed at length. George found he did not mind. He found he minded the opposite of minding. One evening in late May, warm enough now to leave the windows open, the smell of the garden coming in, George sat at the kitchen table after dinner, watching Teddy try to explain to Patrick why the HMS Sackville model wasn't the same as the HMCS Sackville and why that mattered. Patrick was arguing back, good-naturedly, that Teddy was being pedantic. Teddy said he'd looked up pedantic, and that was fine by him. George looked at the two of them, the father who had his sister's eyes, the boy who had sat down across from a stranger and pointed at a watch, and he thought, this is the shape of things now. Not the shape he had expected, not the shape he had chosen, exactly, but the shape that the long, complicated chain of events had made when it finally reached its end. He thought of Joanna, who had believed that things belonging together eventually arrived at the same place. She had been right about a lot of things. She had also been wrong about a lot of things. But not about that.